Boardroom Bound, Episode 23. Headhunters, do you need one to secure a board role? With Russ Reynolds.
The way to get to the top and to be on a corporate board is to do an outstanding job at what you're doing.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of Boardroom Bound. My name is Alexander Lowry, and this is the podcast dedicated to intentional leadership in the boardroom. My goal is to give new and aspiring directors tips, tactics, and strategies necessary to transform your confidence and build a successful career as a board director. Quick reminder, you can get all of today's show notes at podcast.gordon.edu. And in today's episode, we're speaking with Louis Cooper. Louis is the CEO and founder of the Non-Executive Directors Association, which is UK-based members association set up around 13 years ago to support the specific needs and demands of NEDs and trustees across all sectors and at every stage of their life cycle. And he's going to get Louis as an individual has about 25 years experience in governance, risk, and assurance services. He's been a board member himself for multiple situations of two UK-quoted investment trusts, a NED for a UK AIM-listed European oil and gas company. So he brings the background himself of having gone through that life cycle, but now running NEDA, what they're doing is helping both individuals understand that life cycle from the very beginning of being an aspirant NED and thinking about how to position myself, the skill set I need to build the resume, to on the other end having an entire portfolio of boards and thinking about the succession planning that comes from that. And they're also working with companies, thinking about how you upskill their staff, prepare them to be NEDs, but to then bring back value into the organization and are more loyal employees because they're happier. So much information to share about all the resources that they have to cover all of this. A lot of fun to be. Can't wait to give that information to you today. Let's jump into the show. Louis Cooper, welcome to the Boardroom Bound podcast.
Hello, Alexander. It's nice to talk to you today.
Well, delighted to have you here and to talk through all things non-executive director. And I know NED is the term of choice, certainly in the UK and many other parts of the world. In the US, it's often director, independent director, but they all mean basically the same thing. And one of your jobs, and I'd love to talk about it because you have multiple things, I know your LinkedIn profile has so many things going on, is you lead the Non-Executive Directors Association. And I would love for you to share more about that today. Let's just start with a background about how that came about and what it does, and we'll take it from there as a great type of resource that people should be plugging into who want to pursue opportunities to be directors.
Thank you. The Non-Executive Directors Association, NEDA for short, is an organisation in the UK which has been set up as a members association. So we represent people who are at various stages of their career in terms of being a non-executive director. We feel that we really plug a gap that has been in the market for a while in terms of that dedication and that support throughout the life cycle of being a non-executive director. So we started by writing a handbook for non-executive directors, which we called innovatively the NED Handbook.
Easy to remember.
And that book was first published back in 2006-07, and really set the scene in terms of taking people through their understanding of the role and responsibilities and the key elements of undertaking a really board-level assessment of what's required to be a non-executive director or an independent director, as you've said. And we've now recently published our 5th edition, so just last month we published our 5th edition of the handbook, which we've updated for a number of corporate governance changes in the UK, plus added some different perspectives on a range of issues, including strategy, which we see as one of the key elements of being a non-executive director in terms of advising and supporting the board on their strategic objectives and strategic direction. The other things that we do, we're very much an organisation that supports the community. So we regularly produce information to keep our members up to date. We run events on a regular basis. Every month we run a different event in London, typically, but we are expanding now. We're doing activities in Europe and also in the Far East as well. We've had some interest in China We recently had interest coming through from Kazakhstan and from a range of other countries where people are starting to think about the requirements of this type of role. We also support people through a coaching and mentoring process in terms of helping people to understand what the role entails. And I used the term earlier on, life cycle. I think one of the key differentials with our organisation is that we look at the NED role across a life cycle of different activities. So we see 4 real stages of activity. The first is undertaking more planning and objective setting in terms of your own requirements, stepping back and really assessing what you need to do in terms of preparing yourself to be a non-executive director. This tends to be underplayed. I think people quite often dive into a role and don't always take that opportunity just to step back and think about their own perspective and their own requirements. And that's where we encourage people to read the handbook and to really look at their own CV or resume in terms of the skills and the experience and the attributes that you have. One of the key elements, I think, in terms of the role is to redefine your CV, redefine your resume. People tend to think of the NED role as an employment role, but I think you need to think about the value that you bring from day one to the boardroom. So you really need to think about how you restructure your credentials and your CV to really hit the ground running and put across the essential elements of what you will bring to the board from day one.
And that's actually a topic that we've talked about a lot on this show. For example, Matt Craven, episode 13, we did a whole deep dive about how the board resume is entirely different from, say, the executive resume trying to get in the C-suite job.
Very much so, that's right. I think we see a lot of CVs that come across our desk, and I think every CV we've received to date, we've torn up, we've started again in terms of you really just need to think about how you position yourself, because I think the person on the other end has got a short attention span, and we'll look at the key elements coming through from the piece of paper in front of them, and we'll very quickly put you on the no or the yes pile. So I think you need to make sure that the key elements of what you bring really jump out at the reader. The second stage of the life cycle is your new appointment or getting the first appointment, and I think the key thing here is to make sure you do your due diligence and understand what you're getting into. We find a number of people who dive into a role because they feel they need to get their foot on the ladder, and it may not be the best role for them. They may get flattered that they've been offered a role because it's come through a contact or somebody who they've known perhaps in the past. But I think it's important to get the right appointment and to make sure you will be supported through that process. So undertake your own due diligence, as I said, and making sure that you understand the organisation, make sure you get some degree of induction and support in terms of that initial role. The third stage or the third cycle point is developing a portfolio of activities. So once you've got your first role, people then tend to look to build a portfolio of activity. And that really in itself has some pitfalls in terms of taking the wrong options in terms of how you develop that portfolio. I think you need to make sure that you keep yourself up to date. You need to make sure that you focus on your performance as a NED and also the performance of the board, so that you really establish the role and build the appropriate portfolio. And we're finding a number of NEDs building quite a mixed portfolio of activity. So they may have some corporate roles, which will be paid roles, hopefully, but also then build on some areas perhaps of interest, some not-for-profit or some charity, or we're finding sport is a big pull at the moment in the UK. A lot of people are being drawn into sport because sport has gone through a bit of a governance review in terms of how sports in the UK are managed and controlled. So that's quite a popular area. So I think a lot of this can come back to your passions in life in terms of where your passions, where can you put more time and put back some value in terms of your experience, and that dovetails nicely, I think, with the sort of corporate side. So I think it's building a mixed portfolio of activity which really focuses on you as an individual. And the fourth stage of the life cycle is very much thinking about succession planning, both from your perspective but also the board's perspective. Typically with an NED role in the UK in particular, that you've got a shelf life of 3, 6, 9 years depending on your term of office. Typically you'll sign up for an initial 3-year term, and that could roll forward to a 6-year term to a 9-year term. So it's really understanding the succession planning process in terms of you when you need to move on, and then thinking about the other roles that you might move into. But it's also thinking about the board's perspective in terms of making sure that the board is refreshed on a regular basis, and you've got the right people coming through, and the composition of the board in particular is a key feature of corporate governance activity in the UK at the moment, particularly around diversity and getting a good blend of individuals working as a team, as a board that actually achieves its own objectives and has some degree of purpose in terms of how that sort of interplays with what's going on within the organisation.
Louis, I like the way you describe that in terms of succession planning from both perspectives, right? Clearly, as an individual, coming back to maybe the previous stage, you're thinking about your own portfolio and the different opportunities, knowing where you are on a board and where you might be placing out. But also, I'm on the board of the YMCA, and we talk about that openly amongst ourselves of who is in which of their 3-year terms, what year are they in, when are people planning to move on, when are they be forced to move on at the end of 9 years, for example, what skills they have, where does it fit in the matrix, where do we need to fill other people in, and that is just... It should be just standard best practice, and certainly at some of the charities and nonprofit, it isn't always, but it's something that we would all highly advocate, and I'm sure you guys are helping organizations to better understand that.
Yes, I think it also ties into things like board performance evaluation. We've just undertaken a review of an organisation in terms of their board effectiveness, and that has entailed mapping out a skills matrix concept for them in terms of understanding the balance of board skills and experience and getting the right blend of that experience coming through. So I think in the UK at the moment we're looking at how good the board effectiveness review process is. There's a consultation process that's just been published looking at this particular concept because it's seen as a very important area, but in some organisations it just has lip service to a cosy sort of fireside chat with the chairman, and then ticking a few boxes on a questionnaire and we've done the job, as opposed to more rigour around how we make sure that the performance of the board is assessed. We've gone into a number of organisations, and the first thing we would ask is, could you show me the objectives of the board members? And we get a very blank look back because directors don't always see themselves as having to define their own objectives. They come with a raft of experience, and they don't actually see themselves in that light. They've been obviously through the employee route, but having reached the sort of the pinnacle at the top, they sort of question, well, why do I need objectives? I know why I'm here. I know what I'm bringing. But if you think about the employee's position in any organisation, they will go through a regular cycle of performance reviews geared to setting objectives, and they will be reviewed on a regular basis, and hopefully at the end of the year you'll either achieve a pay rise or you might achieve a promotion, but you've got something to sense check. You've got some evidence that you've actually performed effectively through that annual cycle. Board members don't always see themselves in that category. They don't actually set the objectives. The key question is, how do you do a board performance assessment if you haven't got any objectives to actually measure against? So there's quite a lot of dialogue at the moment about how these board reviews are undertaken and how robust they are and how we can make them better, particularly in terms of getting some independent facilitation on a sort of semi-regular basis to make sure that you've got some rigour around the process.
I like that a lot. And in terms of the way you've talked about this life cycle, it makes so much sense. And it sounds so simple as way when we build it down into those blocks of getting ready to take a board seat? So, for example, we talk a lot on the show, it's both new and aspiring directors. So you talked about it before. Some people will just sort of jump into the first opportunity. And I would also caution and say, wait for the right opportunity, because that's when you're going to excel. You'll actually perform at your best. You'll position yourself for long-term success. And that first appointment, getting that first opportunity really sets the tone, because if you don't do well in that, you're never going to build a portfolio as you described in stage 3.
Yes, that's right. And I think it is very much planning and looking at yourself. And I think just doing a simple thing like a SWOT analysis on yourself in terms of what are your strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, that you can actually start to plug some gaps and just think about how you can make sure that you can cover all the bases in terms of the key skills and attributes of being a NED. We've been looking at competencies which apply both to non-executives and executive directors, and we feel that there's a whole range of areas around your knowledge, your skills, your attributes and your experience that need to be drawn out. So when we're talking about knowledge, it's thinking about governance, understanding of sort of codes and guidelines and frameworks and policies, procedures, that sort of thing. Strategy is a second area where you need to bring a range of experience in various concepts, tools, techniques, the business models that are currently in operation. Thinking about performance is a third area around financial reporting in particular, because I think as a board member, you can't say, I don't understand the finances. You do need to make sure that you're on top of your game in terms of finance. And also things like KPIs, key performance indicators, other areas around non-financial reporting, disclosure, transparency. So performance is quite a big element. And also risk management, understanding how the organisation looks at its risk profile, the risk appetite of the organisation, the culture, the infrastructure around risk. And the fifth area is around people, making sure that there's a good understanding of the culture within the organisation, the behaviours of people, and again, the individual performance elements of people within the organisation. So those are sort of some of the knowledge aspects. I think when you're looking at some of the skills, you're considering sort of leadership, decision-making, communication, analysing and influencing. These are some of the sort of the behavioural indicators that, again, you need to be comfortable that you can provide some degree of insight in those areas. And on the competencies which relate to attributes, I think you need to think about ethical areas, high standards of conduct, promoting values of the organisation, how you demonstrate your independence, so encouraging sort of different ideas coming through, challenging the status quo, questioning assumptions that have been made in the past may not be relevant to the current and the future perspective. How you make sure you're a professional in what you do, you're acting with integrity, taking responsibility, investing in your own development through that process. I think, as I said earlier on, you act within a team, so you need to be collaborative in terms of showing empathy to others, working well within the team structure, motivating and encouraging other people, and then that links into being results-driven. So you need to make sure you're determining goals and priorities, setting high standards of performance, and sort of promoting and rewarding success. So I think, as I said, from this sort of SWOT analysis, you should be sort of focusing on those sort of key elements of your own sort of perspective and making sure you've got the right experience blend as well in terms of how you've been developing your sort of career structure through that process.
And Louis, that was such an exhaustive list, which is clearly the ideal that everyone should have, but recognizing certainly those people going down that path of getting their first board seat will have some areas where they're not as strong as others, which is just natural. And I know something that you and I were talking about before the recording started was that you were saying that the one thing you wish you'd known before you started your board career is really taking the time up front to plan that board career. And I think this ties in with what you're saying for the SWOT analysis, coming back and knowing yourself, but also figuring out perhaps where the right board for where you want to start. Can you expand on this a little bit more, sort of lessons learned on your own side?
Yes, I think it's very much really understanding the role and looking at how you can bring a different perspective. I think I talked about diversity earlier on. One thing we're doing to help affect this type of change and get people engaged earlier, which is what I wish I'd done, actually. I wish I'd sort of started earlier in the process. What we're doing is we're running a NED development program where we're going into large organizations and tapping into the talent program that typically large organizations have to keep their people and train and educate their sort of talent program people. And this is where we can help in terms of we developed some programs to train, educate, and mentor and advise and support people to get an NED role in parallel with their executive career, so that the organisation they work for sponsors them to go out and get an NED role or a trustee role, sort of not-for-profit organisation perhaps, to run in parallel with their mainstream career. So they get engaged earlier. They feel that through the education and the work that we do in prepping them and getting them up to speed, they've got the confidence to go into that sort of situation. They get boardroom experience, they get committee experience at an earlier stage, and it's a win-win situation. It's a win for the organisation that's sponsoring them because it really helps to develop the individual, but they also get back the experience when the individual comes back into the organisation, and the individual themselves feel that they're valued. They get good experience outside of their sort of mainstream activity, and feel that they're operating at a much sort of higher level in terms of working with the board and the senior management teams in another organisation. So we see that as a sort of a positive start in terms of getting people on the ladder early. I think the other key thing is to sometimes to start small in terms of getting through your sort of planning of what you're going to do in the future. Take on some roles that may be of interest to you, or take on a role which you can do in your sort of spare time or part-time in terms of outside of your normal day-to-day activities. But it's getting involved earlier, and it's giving you that experience you can then plug into your CV or resume in terms of demonstrating you've got that experience. I think the other thing I would recommend in terms of the aspirant NED is to think about your network and your networking. And this is another area where I feel like I could have added more value to what I do in terms of board activity if I thought about it earlier. And I think the networking thing falls into three elements. It's networking, networking, and networking. So it's networking in terms of your past, it's networking in terms of your current, and it's networking in terms of the future. So you should be getting into areas which will help you to develop your networks in the future. And I think this is an area which can help you to actually link into other roles that might be available as well, because people do move around a lot these days, and just keeping a track of people you used to work with to tell people that you're actually on the lookout for a role is a key but simple mantra, I think, in terms of just putting across the message, I'm looking for a role currently, can you help me in that sort of process? Go out and meet people on a regular basis in terms of coming to events or going to events and getting into a different sort of circle of activity, which doesn't need to be technical. It can be events which are sort of focused on some of the softer elements, softer skills that perhaps you need to develop. So I think there's a range of different things in terms of just really thinking about you and how you take yourself to market. It's how you market yourself in a different way. And I think that's quite a powerful thing to think through and to actually then sort of reposition yourself in that sort of context.
And we talked a lot about that approach, which I loved your three stages, sort of backwards, forwards, and where you are now in terms of your thinking. And we had Heather White on the show on episode 11, and we talked a lot about her boardroom ready matchmaking program. I know you guys partner with her, and I can see a lot of what you're talking about here dovetails with her really well. And I love the way that she's described getting out there, getting people experience, and it benefits the company because people are upskilled. You talked about them being more loyal, they add back to the firm, but it's also great for them building for the long term, rounding out their skill set, understanding what they want to do. And for someone who's listening to this and going, I've always thought I'd like to do something like that. This is great, this is exciting. What's the first step? Is it finding an organization like yourself that helps someone? Do you recommend reading a book? I mean, we talked about your NED Handbook, and you shared a copy with me, and this is a weighty tome. There is so much value in here. You're talking hundreds of pages of value. This is not a short read over one night. There's so much information to digest. Where would you recommend someone begins thinking about all this? What's the exact first step?
I think it really depends on the individual, because I think people have got different styles of engagement and learning, and some people do just like to pick up a book and they will actually read the book and gain a lot of insight and a lot of information and sort of use that as a stepping stone. Other people like the interaction and they like to meet people and they like to talk to people, which is why we encourage our regular networking events to go and talk to people, get their experience. We find in particular our events are sort of split down into a third. A third of people who come along are aspirant. A third of people are perhaps at their first stage of career with one NED role, and the other third are people who are plural. They've got a portfolio of activities. So we get a very much a rich blend of discussion and experience that sort of comes through that process. Some people also like to go through the training and education side of things. So we do run an essentials training program, and that is very much geared around the book. So you come on the course, you get a copy of the book, plus an extensive reading list. You go through your own learning, and then you can take a test at the end of the process and gain an NED certificate to demonstrate that you've got the learning and the overall requirements. That is also an e-learning capability as well that we provide. You can actually purchase 9 webinars linked to the book, then linked to the test, so you can do everything remotely. You don't actually have to come into the classroom. But we also then support people in terms of joining people up from different or the same industry sectors. So we encourage people to talk to others and can act as a bit of a matchmaker. We ran a session recently which was an entrepreneurial-focused seminar where we had half the audience had "I want to be a NED" and the other half of the audience had "I want a NED." So it's a bit of a sort of a matchmaking sort of process in terms of
board speed dating.
Yeah, it's a bit of that's right. It's a sort of speed dating type of activity. But I appreciate that some of the listeners won't be in the UK and so won't be able to sort of attend some of the events that we run. But I'm always happy to talk to people about their experience and with the book and with other things that we can provide. There could be some good dialogue that we enter into in terms of helping people through that sort of process of navigating their career to the boardroom. And I'm pleased to hear that Heather White's been engaged on the process as well, because as you say, we partner with her organisation, and I think she's leading a bit of a crusade in terms of board apprenticeships, in terms of bringing people into the boardroom and helping them gain the confidence, etc., in terms of that level of dialogue and interaction with boards, so they can start that process over a period of time, and then get that sort of final appointment through that degree of interaction with that particular organisation.
Right, and Louis, to that point, your organization that is established, successful, has lots of resources, opportunities, events, trainings, webinars. People listening to this will probably want to follow up. What would be the best way for them to contact you?
I think there is obviously a link on the website that you can ask questions or follow up and ask for information. I'm happy for people to contact me via LinkedIn or through email, and can also then give some indication of current activities. We have got membership available, and if anybody comes through this route, we can offer a discounted membership, which will give regular information flows, opportunity to get involved in some other dialogue and get your hands on a book as well. So I think there's various ways of making contact, and we're, our communication lines are open, and we're keen to engage and talk with people.
Well, that's great, and I will make sure we have links in the show notes to your profile and the website and all that information. And you gave us so much value just in a half an hour. There was so much that we covered, and so simple to understand in sense of the 4 stages of the life cycle. Anybody can imagine where they are within that and how to take it forward in an individual way. And Louis, we were delighted to have you on the show today. Thank you for sharing your insights and helping all of us to be boardroom bound.
Thank you. Can I just leave you with three words? We think
Please.
the value that NEDs can bring, I've really focused on 3 main things, and it's our KPI. So it's knowledge, it's making sure that you're up to date with latest developments and you've got that sort of knowledge that you can bring. The P is for performance and focusing on high quality performance from yourself as an individual, but also as part of the team. And the I is independence. So you need to be the voice of positive challenge. You need to be the person who's going to ask the questions and keep on asking the questions until you get a sensible answer. So you do need to bring each of those KPI elements to your board activity.
I like that. That's a great way to wrap it up. So everybody be aware of your KPIs. Well, Louis, thank you so much for joining us on the show today.
Thank you, Alexander. It's been a pleasure, and thank you for the opportunity to talk to your wider audience.
That's it for this episode of Boardroom Bound. I really enjoyed chatting with Louis Cooper. It was brilliant how he took the entire life cycle of a board director down into 4 simple stages. From at the very beginning, planning what you would like to do, how to do it, and positioning yourself. Think about the board resume, through getting on your first board, and then going from one board to a portfolio board careers, and then finally the succession planning for yourself and the board as a whole. It really encapsulated so much you need to cover, but then great detail and resources to be shared along the way to help every individual. Now remember, if you go over to podcast.gordon.edu, you can find links to all of the resources that we described today. And the Boardroom Bound team and I are proud to be your go-to podcast for all things that connect, prepare, and empower you to land a board seat. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss any of the high-quality content that we're bringing to you every Wednesday. Thanks for joining me today. I can't wait to share more stories and strategies from brilliant business minds with you again next week. Remember to keep tuning in to be Boardroom Bound.